This is April 12th, 1971, and this tape is being recorded at my home where my wife and I, Claire, live in Santee, California, in a large mobile home park. And our son and daughter have both requested that now if there is such a thing as a tape recorder, that re-record some of the events which they, and I guess we do too, think is important that happened during our rather long life. So I'm going to start this tape here and tell you as much as I can. I won't guarantee all the dates, but I have records covering most of the things, and I hope that some of you future generations of our children, grandchildren, and so on down the line might get a kick out of what we've got to say on these two tapes. I think the first thing in order is a little bit of my family history, and Claire will have a tape with her family history and all about herself on it. So I'll tell you about me. The Hoke family side of my family, of course, should be first. I don't have too much information about them, except that I do know that my grandfather Hoke came to this country as a young man in the 1840s. And the Hokes were involved in those religious wars which they were having in Germany at that time. And they were practically, I think, driven out of that country, along with thousands of others. And my grandfather worked his way somehow, I don't know. He was a very close-mouthed man and didn't like to talk about the old days. I remember him, of course, very well, for I was only about 12 years old, I would judge, when he passed away. But he made his way to Litchfield, Illinois, and there he married a Pennsylvania Dutch gal, and then they made their way overland to Iowa, and they settled in Clark County, Iowa, and homesteaded or took up land there. And my father was one of 11 children that was born in a log cabin on the banks of a creek in this county in 1861. And my father was just about as close-mouthed about his future, or his past rather, as his father was. But I know that he ultimately worked as hired man on a farm and all those jobs, few jobs that a young fellow could get in those days. But he finally got a job as a section hand on the Burlington Railroad at Kent, Iowa. And there he married my mother in 1888, when he's working as a section hand and drawing 99 cents a day. And when he was married, they just completed a new branch railroad line coming into Creston, Iowa, which is north of Kent. And they promoted my father to section foreman. And him and my mother moved up into this depot. That was their home for quite a few years at Spalding, Iowa. And they were brand spanking new depot and a new railroad and everything. And four of us children who survived were all born in this depot. And my mother acted as depot agent and freight handler and everything else. Till later on, my father was promoted on up the line, and when he passed away in 1923, he was an official on the Burlington Railroad, And my dad passed away at that time, as I say. My mother way outlived him, and she was 96 years old when she passed away. My father and mother buried side by side in a family plot back in near Spalding, Iowa. On my mother's side of the family, she came from a real old family, and incidentally, I do have family records that go back to in the 1600s for both sides of the family. And my mother's family immigrated from England. I can't tell you exactly when, but I got the records here back to 1634. And I had ancestors that fought in the Revolutionary War. My grandfather Dunlap, my mother's father, young man, had quite experience. He got involved in the Civil War real early on the Union side and was captured, was paroled, went back to Maryland, Baltimore at that time, and finished his schooling as a doctor and re-entered the Army as a doctor. And I have his journal that tells about his experiences in the Civil War. And later on, as he immigrated west, gradually ended up in Iowa as a doctor. I was born there in this depot in Spalding, Iowa in 1892. And I don't remember my birth day back there too, well, my first one, but I can recall quite well my early days there in Spalding. I went to for the first time, a little old dinky one-room schoolhouse. It was heated by an old coal stove sitting in the middle of it, and the lunch we took to school in the wintertime sat on a bench in the back of the schoolroom, and many times at noon when we started your lunch, our sandwiches in there would be frozen. And I think that I must have been about 6 years old when we moved into Creston. My father had been promoted to the yard foreman there in this big terminal. And I went on school there. And later on, we moved over to Red Oak, where he was transferred over there as roadmaster on that end of the division. I finished the 8th grade there in Red Oak, and then I went on to high school, and then I went on to business college in Omaha. And when I finished that, I got a position with the Ford Motor Company there in Omaha when they were, the old Model T Ford was just coming out very strong, and I worked for Ford there for quite a while. I traveled on the road for them out in the west when there was still a little bit of the west left. And when I come back down and went to work in a garage there in my hometown of Red Oak. And I was there and enlisted in the Iowa National Guard, Company M, 168th Infantry, in 1915. And in 1916, the National Guard was mobilized all over the United States, and we were sent to the Mexican border. And that was about 9 or 10 months of the most frustrating time of my life, going down there. We were stationed at Brownsville, Texas, and just about all we done was close order drill. There was nothing else to do. This was a kind of a political mess at that time, and the weather was hot, and I never seen so many bugs and things in all my life. And of course, the main complaint I had, we were under canvas all that time, was the food. The Army ration allowance at that time was 19 cents a day per man. And I can assure you that we didn't live very luxurious on 19 cents a day. just seems to me, as I look back on it now, that our main diet was beans and macaroni and salmon, which salmon in those days was a very common food, and today it's a luxury. And we stayed down on the border until we came back in February of 1917, and we hadn't been long, of course, home and demobilized a very short time till World War I started in Europe. And I was put on special recruiting duty. And we came back with about 50 men from the border, and wars declared in Europe, so they increased the strength of my company to 150 men, and I recruited right close to 100 of those fellows. And in the fall of that year, we went east. We were camped out under canvas on Long Island until it came time to go overseas, and we became part of that famous 42nd Rainbow Division. And General MacArthur, after we got to France, became our brigade commander. I certainly don't want to say that I was on speaking terms with MacArthur, but I've seen a lot of him, and he was all the soldier that history records him as being. I can assure you of that. We left in the fall of the year on a ship that had been interned in New York Harbor, a combination freighter passenger ship that had belonged to the German government. And of course the Germans knew that we were going to get into this war, and they certainly had sabotaged that ship. It took the government here quite a few months to restore that ship to usable condition. And we boarded it and sailed from New York for France. And I'm telling you, that ship was in terrific condition. The repair job, overhaul job hadn't been any too good. I can't blame them too much. But we got out 4 days to sea, and the ship broke down, and the boilers were all leaking so bad they couldn't keep up steam in the ship. And so we turned around all by ourselves out there, and of course everybody was scared to death that we could see a German submarine on the other side of every wave that went by the ship. We made our way back to New York, and went back into our old campground, and we were there quite a few weeks. And of course the government, you might say, had washed us off the records, but finally a British liner, the White Star liner, the Shellac, came into New York, and they loaded us on that ship. And we started out again. And we went up first to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And was in that harbor there waiting for a convoy of a lot of ships to be formed. And we finally, one afternoon, sailed out of Halifax Harbor. And we got out to sea, and then they got radio word that a big Munson ship had been blown up there in Halifax Harbor. And of course, I today couldn't tell you which ship it was, but it's a matter of history. But anyway, this Munson ship that blew up, its explosion blew up some other ships in the harbor and practically destroyed Halifax, and hundreds of people were killed. And we crossed the North Atlantic on this cruise in a large convoy, and in November, dead of winter, I can remember pulling into Belfast Harbor in Ireland, and we were there over Thanksgiving Day. The food was sure lousy on this British ship, and they claimed that they served us turkey on Thanksgiving, but every man on that ship, and there was, we were quite a number of us, all insisted it was seagull that they'd served us. We finally landed after 2 or 3 days in Belfast Harbor. We crossed the Irish Sea one afternoon and managed to pull into Liverpool, England. And from there, we took a train down to Winchester, England, and went in English barracks there. And that was our first experience, you might say. We began to feel something about what was going on over there as far as the war is concerned. For we had to eat English food, and it was certainly in short supply, and didn't satisfy any of us at all. I had a rather interesting experience there in England at that time, for Winchester was has a famous cathedral there, which they claim was the seat of King Arthur's Round Table. And I managed to get a pass and go down into the town, and I visited that cathedral, and they had a great big old round table bolted up to the wall up near the altar, and they claimed that was his round table, and there was a small opening in the wall up near the ceiling, and that this old Englishman that took me around on the tour, there was a bunch of, I think I had 8 men with me that day. I was in charge of them. I had to make darn sure that they got back to the campground that night. And he claimed that King Arthur, there was stairs going up into this opening in the wall, and MacArthur would climb up there and listen to see what his knights were talking about around on the round table. As I said, I was in charge of this particular group. In fact, I was a corporal at that time. And this English guide happened to notice that I had on a Masonic ring. And he was quite astounded. He says, "Do you mean to tell me that you're a Mason and you're only an enlisted man in the Army?" I said, "That is correct," and he just couldn't believe it. He said, "Only the officers in the English Army can become a Mason over here." So maybe after all I did live in a democracy. After a short stay there in Winchester, we got on the train and were taken down to Southampton and boarded a cross-channel steamer. And if the Germans had ever been able to sink that ship that particular night when we crossed the channel, I tell you, there never would have been a person saved on that ship, because we were packed in there just like sardines. You couldn't even sit down. You had to stand up the entire crossing. And we finally landed at Brest. No, I'm wrong on that. We landed at Le Havre and were put into an English camp, and they were nothing but just open-sided sheds with bunks in there, no mattresses on the bunks, just heavy mesh chicken wire, and that's what we were supposed to sleep on. And the food was something to write home about. I remember my squad, and I was a corporal and have to go draw the rations. I got, I think, 2 cans of, little small cans of liver paste, and 4 or 5 slices of bread, and a little can of marmalade. And that was our food just twice a day, and a cup of tea. We finally, and of course the weather, as you know, was atrocious over there in that country at that time, for continuous rain. And we were a very uncomfortable group of people. Finally, we got on a train from there and started across France to the town where we would be billeted in for some time. And I think we were on this train something like 3 days. And to start the journey, they come along and open the compartment door and threw in a couple of packages of hardtack and a couple of cans of tomatoes and a couple of cans of Cornwelly, and that was supposed to last us for this 3-day train journey. Of course, those coaches, cross compartments on them, wooden seats, no restrooms, and every time the train made a stop at any place, it was quite a sight to see all those soldiers out there along the railroad tracks for the lack of restrooms. We got into the town where we would be billeted for some time, and it was cold and bitter and miserable, snow on the ground, and that was our first experience with French billets. I had my squad up in the haymow of a house in the town. Of course, you know, over there, the farmers don't live out in farmhouses. They all live in the little villages, and that's where we were. And then they started in to build us, and we drew a lot of new equipment and type of things, and the men, the shoes had gone completely to pieces. There were men there practically barefooted. We didn't have the heavy combat boots shoes that we got later on. These were just light, might say a regular pair of civilian shoes, certainly not fitted for that kind of weather and the cobblestone highways and things like that in that country. And we spent a miserable time over there over Christmas and New Year's, and then they moved us to another point. I don't want to bore you with a lot of personal details, and I could tell you innumerable stories about that first winter over there in France. It was rough, mostly due to the fact to lack of shipping to bring in oversupplies from the United States. They had nothing in France. 4 years of war had depleted them, and everything, every major item was certainly in short supply. And due to the lack of shipping, we were kind of up against it because food and equipment and clothing and the like, shoes, which we all badly needed, made life rather rough. And say it was one of those real cold winters. I drilled out there in fields where there was a foot of snow on the ground, and we had no heat, of course, of any kind. And the food was the thing, of course, that we missed the most. You take a bunch of young men like that with hearty appetites and being outdoors all the time, naturally they thought they were going to starve to death. Say they moved us later on, right after the first year, over into another area not too far away. I know we hiked it, and we spent not too long a time there. And in February, word came that we were moving to the front. And on that particular trip, we boarded trains again. And this time it was in boxcars that held either 8 horses or 40 men. And when you put 40 men into one of those little French boxcars, I can assure you there wasn't very much room to lay down to try to get a little bit of sleep. And we got up to the front, the trenches in Lorraine, and we took over an area there from the French army, and they started to shove us into the lines to get training in trench warfare. My particular company, Company M, and Company F from Vliska, was assigned to make the first full-strength company raid into the German trenches. And we'd done a little training for that up there, and then we went into the trenches. And on the 9th of March, we went over the top for the first time and penetrated into German trenches. We got into the third lines, and our particular outfit didn't actually, the point of the raid was to try to capture prisoners to get information. I never seen a German. They did say that I killed some down in the dugout there. I got a French medal for it. but never could prove that. We took quite a few casualties that day. The sad part of it was that quite a few of those boys that were killed, I think there was something like 15 of them killed and some 20 or 30 wounded in this particular raid, and most of those that did suffer were young fellows that I'd recruited back home, and kids I'd went to school with and played with and all that sort of stuff. Pretty rough, but of course you couldn't let your feelings get the better of you at that time. We had a long tour in the trenches, and I was in and out of them quite a lot of times. In the meantime, I'd been promoted to sergeant, and I went over on quite a few raids and scouting parties in the German lines, and it wasn't so bad after the weather warmed up a little bit. And incidentally, I was supposed to be, when we got up there in the trenches, we were supposed to be armed with a Colt 45 automatic pistol. Well, they'd issued me the holster and the belt and 24 rounds of ammunition before we left New York, and I carried that all that time, but no pistol. And the morning of this first raid over in the enemy lines, somehow nobody had received their pistols yet that were supposed to have them, but the colonel of our regiment had managed to go back somewhere in the rear, and he had an old Dodge sedan that he uses for transportation. And he got some warehouse back there someplace, and he filled the back seat of that Dodge sedan with brand new Colt automatics. And that morning, when we lined up to start down through the trenches up in the front line, here come the colonel with these pistols, and each one of us soldiers that were entitled to one got it. And I never handled, never fired a gun like that in my life, didn't know anything about it, and it was packed solid full of cosmoline grease to preserve it. And I and a buddy of mine sat there in the front trench that day under quite a bit of shell fire, and all I had was a khaki-colored handkerchief. And I tore that into strips, and I spent about 2 or 3 hours up there figuring out how to take this gun apart, clean all that cosmoline oil out of it, and get it in working condition so I could load it, which I finally managed to do, and I was able to get off a few shots with it that afternoon on the raid. But I can't say that I'd done any damage to anybody, but I had the fun of shooting it. And I carried and used that gun all through the war, and again after the war. And I still have in my possession that original 45 Colt, my original belt, holster, ammunition pouch, clip pouch, first aid pack, everything I can, and I can assure you that I treasure that very highly. I'm not trying to tape a history of World War I, just some of the personal things that happened to me while I was party of it. But I was in, our division was on every major front over there, and every major battle that took place. It kind of shows up in the records in itself for out of the original 248 men of us that sailed on the ship from New York. 80 some of them were killed. And I think there was only 28 in the whole company that had not been wounded. So you can see that we did see considerable action. We moved out of the trenches. We went over to that Champagne front near Shadow Theory, and we lost a lot of men there. And then we come back and was in fighting around St. Mihiel. And again, we lost a lot of men there. All 4 platoons in my company were commanded by sergeants. The officers had all been killed or wounded. And from there we went into the fighting on the Meuse-Argonne. Started out at Old Verdun and right up to there was heavy mountainous hills and pretty rugged going. Of course, we lost a lot of men there. And incidentally, I've kind of overlooked something. I have a brother, Howard, who, when I was on recruiting duty, he wanted to join the company, but he couldn't pass the physical. He had a rupture, so he went to the hospital and had his rupture corrected. And when he got through and was back home again, our company was full. So he went over and enlisted in an adjoining town in Company F, and he went to France with Company F. And after we got up into the trenches, I managed to get him transferred back to into Company M, so he was with me all the rest of the war, practically speaking. And here's a little story that pertaining to my brother. You couldn't travel around France. You just you were stuck absolutely tight into the village wherever you were billeted. But one particular Sunday, before we ever entered the trenches, I found out where my brother was and what town he was in, and it was only about, let's say, 10 miles from the town I was in. And I had not seen him since we had left the United States, since we got off that broken-down ship. His battalion was sent out on Governor's Island, and I was sent out to, my outfit was out there on Long Island, as I said. So this particular Sunday, I got a pass, managed to finagle it some way, and started hiking with a buddy over this town where I knew my brother was. And we walked and got ourselves, let's say, lost, and road goes up on top of crossing over the top of a high hill, and we stopped there, and you could see some villages in the distance, and we didn't know which one to go to. And here we seen a soldier way down the foot of this steep hill come walking up across the fields towards where we were. And we thought, well, maybe he knows where we are. And so I and this companion of mine started downhill, met this fellow down there coming up the hill, and lo and behold, it was my brother. And he'd finagled a pass that morning, found out where I was, and he was trying to find my village, and he was lost the same as I was. He was, when we were on this raid of March 9th, there was his company that accompanied us on that raid, and on returning out of the trenches, he was very badly gassed. Gas shell, they were marching, pulled out of the trenches, were marching back to the rear. Enemy gas shell come over and lit right in the midst of his squad. And he was the only survivor of that squad. And after he got over his gas attack and got back out of the hospitals, when he was back with the regiment again, is when I got him transferred to back into Company M. Of course, this being a personal history, I think I have the privilege of including my brother in it. So at another time, I was commanding a platoon, and this was up in the Argonne Forest, and the going up there was real rough. And at this particular time, my company was back in reserve, and we were trying to supply the 2 companies that were up in the front lines with ammunition and food and what have you. And I got orders to organize a ammunition carrying detail, and I think it composed about 25 men to carry a large supply of ammunition up into the front lines that night. And that was kind of the rough part of having my brother with me. He'd been promoted to corporal by that time, and a lot of dirty details come up, a lot of them dangerous, of course, and I just didn't hardly dare exclude my brother from any of those details. He sure got his share of them, and maybe a little bit more at times. But on this particular affair, they were carrying this ammunition up in heavy steel boxes, a cat or two strung on a long pole, and two men, a man on each end of the long pole, and they had to cross a steep valley between two heavy woods. And of course the Germans knew that we were using those paths across this valley, and spasmodically they would shell this particular valley, just throw a quick salvo of a bunch of shells in there, and invariably they caught somebody. And on that detail that night, the men would run across this valley as fast as they could, and when the two men, always was four men to each one of these poles. And when the two guys carrying would become exhausted, the other two would step right in underneath, put their shoulders underneath the pole, and away they go, still at a dead run. But the Germans caught that ammunition carrying detail that night, and out of some 20, 25 men, my brother and two others were the only ones that survived. The rest, all of them, before they put a salvo right down on the carrying detail. Of course, that's the fortunes of war. Of the 5 major attacks or battles that I was engaged in outside of our some 3 months up in the trenches at the very start of the thing, they were all different. There was different terrain, and we were up against different types of enemy troops, and every one of them, of course, we took a lot of casualties. I think one of them on a Champagne front, when the Germans made their final desperate attack to break through and end the war in July of 1918, on that Champagne front, our regiment was holding the third lines with the French in front of us, and our orders were to we were not to give that up. We were to fight on that. That was the last line, and we were very close to Paris, at that time. And we took a lot of casualties in that thing when the Germans made their big attack, all of them by shell fire. We lost a lot of good men there, and because when the attack come, the men were all out in the open. And I picked up a little wound myself there in that particular front, but it wasn't bad enough that I'd leave and go to the rear or be hospitalized or anything. And this may sound kind of silly, but a shell exploded right in front of me on the parapet going down into a dugout. And I was standing at the entrance of that parapet, and I say the shell exploded right in front of me, and I got a little wound in my back. Now, if you can explain that, but they do peculiar things. The fighting of Chateau Thierry was, I think, in some respects, the worst of all, for we lost the most men there, and that was all out in the open, right out in wheat fields, and it was a desperate attempt on the part of the Germans to stop us, and you got to give them credit for being very effective soldiers at that time. They still had a lot of good men left in their army, and it was hot, of course. This happened all in July and around the 1st of August, and they had some very efficient machine gunners in that outfit, and we lost a terrific amount of men machine gun fire, and of course artillery too. From there we moved to the St. Mihiel front. And then we captured a salient that had been in the hands of Germans for over 4 years. And I have to acknowledge they did not have too good caliber troops to face us there on that sector. And we took a lot of losses there, mostly due to the fact that we'd, by that time, about half of our company were replacements. And the platoon sergeants and the officers were standing up on their feet trying to get these men up and going across to get into enemy lines and knock out those machine gun nests. And that ended up that we had a second lieutenant commanding the company and a first lieutenant commanding the battalion. All the rest of them had either been killed or wounded. And that was real rough going. That was out in the open. But after we once got through the Germans' front lines that morning, and we were through them by noon, and were advancing, we were pretty much out in the open, and we captured a village that afternoon called Benny. And it had been a division headquarters. And the town was full of supplies and equipment, one thing and another, that the Germans just abandoned, left behind. I mean, they were moving out fast. And we captured a wine cellar that was full of cognac, and you know what happened about that. And we also, they had a band that they kept quartered in this village, and they had abandoned all their instruments and took off. And there was fellas out there in the street, soldiers, for get them all reorganized and going again. They got these band instruments and a few drinks of that cognac, and there were some German spiked helmets in the town, and it was quite a sight on the little main street of this village to see those guys out there, most of them a little too much cognac in them, and parading up down that street trying to blow a horn, and all that cognac in them, and we finally got going again. But we did also capture the German paymaster's office, and there was a big chest in there full of German money, paper marks, and every guy got a fistful of that money. And I remember sending home one or two of those bills as souvenirs. And this may be off the record, but some of the fellows were using that German money as toilet paper. At that time, we never dreamed that there wouldn't be too many months until we'd be into Germany, where that German money used to be good. And they burned it, they lit their cigarettes with it, and all that kind of stuff. That was at least we got a little break now and then. And then we moved into the Argonne at Verdun. And for that time, it was getting up into fall, late September, and the weather's beginning to change. And of course, that's rainy over in that country, and cold and wet and fog and misery. And the Germans really were trying to fight to a last man in the Argonne, because they knew if they lost that we'd have access to a lot of their big supply centers on to the north. And they really put up a desperate battle. It was extremely hilly country. You could, in some respects, call it mountainous, and thick forest, and roads were just quagmires. They couldn't get supplies up to us. And the Germans had all these pre-prepared positions. Machine gun nests, all well fortified, and not only my division, but all of them that were engaged, nearly every one of them were in this fight up through the Argonne. Took an enormous number of casualties. My company was fortunate enough that in that we've been in advance, frontline company in St. Mihiel. We were back in the third company behind, our battalion was. So we didn't see too much of it in some respects until the last tail end of it. And I can assure you it was rough going. I just didn't know whether my brother and I was ever going to make it through that phase of it. We finally moved up and took over the front lines in there, what you could call front lines, or nothing but just a series of foxholes, shell holes, that we took shelter in. And I was lucky enough to, of course the men were all out in the open, and me too, but there was one of those big old country farms there. You couldn't call it a chateau, but it was one of the rare ones for an individual farm of that country. For as I said, otherwise the farmers all live in the villages. But I got a place to sleep down for a couple of nights in this farmhouse, down in the cellar underneath it, and I was in a wine cellar. And the Germans had retreated. Of course, we just captured that, I think the day before, something like that. And they'd mined this house, or farm. And that night about 9 o'clock, this delayed fuse on that mine went off. And I don't know whatever held that old stone and brick farmhouse together, because the shock of the explosion threw me clear across the room. I was sound asleep when the thing went off. And of course, we had nothing but candles down there for light, and the explosion, the blast of it, blew out all the lights, and it's rather bad. Don't expect this story to be all coordinated, because as I talk about one thing, it brings up memories of something else that happened. On this particular time I'm just talking about, where the farmhouse was practically blown up, I'd been sent back the evening before to try to bring food up to and ammunition up to our men there in the front lines. And I couldn't get through that night. And the company had moved forward, pitch dark, raining like the dickens, and I just couldn't find my way back up to where the men were positioned at that time. But the next morning at daybreak, I remember I just slept in the ditch, call it sleeping if you want to, alongside the road up on top of a hill. Daylight the next morning, I had my detail, something like maybe 20 men, and we had those ration cans they cooked hot food and put into, like a great big oversized thermos can. And of course, at that time, the dinner was stone cold and all that. And when I got back up to the company, around about 10 o'clock that morning, and the men were all in a little patch of woods. And the men lined up to eat this cold food. It was all, the grease was cold. I remember there was fried potatoes in there, and they were just solid, and the grease in there, but the men ate them. But the men lined up, and they started to dish out this food to them, and the captain told me he knew I'd been up all night, and they told me to go over there and go in the basement of this farmhouse and get a little sleep. And while I was over there, the Germans, of course, country that they just surrendered, given up a day or so before, And they had every square inch of that ground plotted, and they just had it figured there'd be troops in this farmhouse, and they'd be in that little patch of woods there. So, I don't know whether they spotted us from an observation balloon or not, but anyway, they threw a salvo of shells over there into this woods, little patch of woods. And they caught our men all lined up there waiting for their chow. And as I recall, there was something like 15 or 20 men killed and about 30 wounded. One of them was a fellow from Atlantic, Iowa that I'd recruited. And, soldiers always talked about what they were going to do when they got back home. After this war was over, the first thing they were going to do, and everyone had all kind of silly things in their mind they wanted to do. I can recall mine particularly was that I wanted to go back, and there was a drugstore there in my hometown that was famous for their thick malted milks. I liked the pineapple malt, and that's the first thing I was going to do was go right downtown and get myself a pineapple malt. And to make a long story partly short, that's just exactly what I done when I did get back home. The next day, I went up and got my malt. But anyway, this young fella, they talk about it, and they try to make their stories kind of silly, of course. And, he always insisted that he was going to live through this war, and he's going to have a leg shot off. And he said, I'll get back home ahead of you guys. And so he said, I'll have this wooden leg. And he said, I'll meet you at the depot when we come back. And he said, I'm going to have this hollow leg full of good bourbon whiskey. And he said, I'll just take that old wooden leg off, and I'll pass that leg full of whiskey around to all you guys. That fella had a leg blown off at that particular time. And I can recall him laying there on the ground while they got stretcher bearers organized to carry him back. And he was under shock, but he was conscious. He wasn't suffering too much. The leg was not completely off. It was just hanging there by a few ligaments. And he laid there on the ground, and he said, you guys thought I was kidding. He said, I know my leg's gone. He said, I can see that. And he said, I'll meet you at the depot with that wooden leg full of bourbon. Well, they finally got the stretcher bearers up there, and they carried that fellow back to a first aid station that was down in the trench, which was right close to where the mule ambulances come up and take the wounded onto the rear. And they put him down in that dressing station, and one of the corpsmen there razor blade and those ligaments, and threw the guy's leg up over the side of the trench. They loaded him in an ambulance, and same as the rear, but he died in the ambulance. I apologize for a rather an unpleasant war story, but let me assure you there's nothing pleasant about war in any shape or manner, and I just hope that nobody will ever see another one. And here we're in the midst of having them killed over there in Vietnam right now, and wounded and crippled for life. Well, I've just been talking about up there in Argonne, the Germans had prepared what they called their final line of defense. They named it the Gramophone. And that was what we had to capture. We felt that, or the brass did rather, that when we broke that line, that the Germans then would have to retreat good many miles north of there and cross the Meuse River, and then put up another final battle there. And so the fighting was rather desperate to capture that line, and my company and my regiment, and the regiment from Alabama was on our left and we were the two key regiments in this attack to break and capture that Dillon line, which we did. And of course we lost quite a few men in doing it. But then the Germans pulled out en masse. They just took off and fast as they could to get over across the Meuse River. Well, we were still advanced companies in this particular attack, and we started to chase the Germans across those hills and woods and one thing another to the Meuse River. And they would stop, leave a few so-called sacrificial machine gunners behind to delay our advance while they were moving their own men and equipment and everything and supplies, but they abandoned most everything. But that was just about as rough a going as I've ever had when we were chasing these Germans. And we got into the first towns where the French were still living and still had been there in these villages since the very start of the war back in 1914. And they sure did welcome us with open arms as we advanced through those villages. We could see them in the distance, we could see the towns, and once in a while you'd see a town in the distance and there wouldn't be a sound or anything out of it, and then all at once there'd be people standing up on the roofs of those houses waving white flags, which was indicative that the Germans had left the town and had gone on the other side, so we knew that it was perfectly safe to advance into the village or town and wouldn't have any trouble. But of course we did continually run into these sacrificial machine gun nests as we advanced. And you know, the very peculiar thing about it is that those gunners would fire at us, but I think they'd done it deliberately. But they had their sights set high, and you could hear those machine gun bullets whistling. It sounded like 6 inches over your head, I don't know. Then they would take their machine gun apart real quickly, and they would kick off their army boots and retreat as fast as they could in bed, because these machine gun nests were up on a hill. And you could see them running, and when we get up there where the machine gun nest was, there would be 6 or 8 pair of those boots laying on the ground around the perimeter of the machine gun nest, or placement, whatever you want to call it. And when we go into one of these villages, I'm telling you, with those French, they couldn't believe it, that we were American soldiers. The Germans had never told them that we were advancing or anything like that. And they didn't even, a lot of them didn't know that the Americans were involved in this thing, and they had no idea that we were over there with a big army and were defeating the Germans. And they'd bring poor devils, they didn't have any food, but they would scare up that, all they had was German war bread. Some of them would bring out some chunks of meat that they'd hoarded one thing or another, and there was lots of throwing their arms around the neck and passing out bottles of very poor liquor. And we kept advancing and advancing until we got to the Meuse River. And the Germans were on the other side, practically so. My platoon was in the lead. And they were doing considerable machine gun firing at us. They hadn't got the artillery up yet and got into placement. And right down, we're up on a high ridge of hills, a half a mile out of the village. It was down there on the banks of the Meuse River. And so, I don't know if they had this thing on or off. I was ordered to take a patrol and go down and try and capture this village if I got to do too heavy fire to not wait, and they attacked it the next day in force. This is long late in the afternoon. So I took my platoon and we started down from this village. And I got about halfway there, and I